Hello my friends, Jeff, Tax Rescue CPA. Today we're going to talk about IRS interest and penalties. I know, not the most exciting topic, but when you specialize in filing back taxes, this is one you have to deal with. And unfortunately, sometimes I am the bearer of some pretty bad news. So I wanted to talk to you about what they are, when they apply, and give you some rules of thumb so that you can anticipate how much these interest and penalties are going to add up to. Okay, so let's talk about what kind of penalties the IRS is going to hit you with a late return. So we're going to be dealing with late filing penalties and late payment penalties. And as they sound, this is for if you file your tax return after the due date, there's a penalty. And there's a penalty if you pay the tax after the due date. And of course, this only applies if you have taxes due, okay? Now, the calculation for these penalties are fairly complicated. And what usually happens when I try to explain the calculation, people just say, okay, but just how much is it gonna be? And that because there are so many moving pieces to it, what I've come up with is some rules of thumb that you can get pretty close, pretty simply, to what the penalties and interest are going to add up to on your specific filing, okay? Now, the interest, also let's deal with the interest. The interest is simply calculated as it's a percentage that the IRS changes once a quarter. Every 3 months they reevaluate this based on the interest rate environment, and they may change the amount, and this is just calculated like regular interest from the date that it was due. It's like an implied loan. Okay, and then there's one other penalty to mention, and that's the underpayment penalty. And this is the penalty if you don't make your estimated payments on time or in the right amount. But that penalty, the underpayment penalty, is relatively minor compared to the others. So we're going to kind of just breeze over that one and throw that in because it's just not going to make that big of a difference. Okay, so let's look at my rules of thumb I've come up with and calculated so you know what to expect. The first one is if you file 1 year, up to 1 year late, you can expect the interest and penalties to be 32% of the tax due. At 2 years, it becomes about 38%. At 3 years, we're kind of right at the halfway point, if you will. At 3 years late, you can expect the interest and penalties to be 50% of the tax due. 4 years, we're up to 60% of penalties and interest. And by the time you're at 5 years late, you're hitting right about 75% of the tax, 75% of the tax due, you're going to be hit with interest and penalties. Okay, now this of course fluctuates depending on the interest rate during this period that your late payment it occurs. Depending on what the rates were. So again, these are rules of thumb to give you sort of a ballpark of what to expect when you file that return with a late amount due. So let's take an example real quick. If you're filing a tax return that's 3 years overdue and there's a tax balance, this is just the tax amount that's due of $3,000, well, our 3-year rule of thumb is 50%. So you can expect the interest and penalties to be half of that, again, on top of the $3,000. So half of $3,000 is $1,500. So you're going to have $3,000 worth of taxes and about $1,500 worth of interest and penalties. Okay, now you say, great, Jeff, that's all well and good if I owe taxes, but what if I'm going to get a refund? Well, that's a great question because if you've noticed that all of these calculations are based on the amount of tax due. And so if you're getting a refund, there's no tax due. So there are no penalties on a refund return. So even if you file a return 2 years late, but there's a refund due, then you actually won't have any interest and penalties, but you actually will get a little bit of interest from the IRS because they essentially held your money for a little bit of time. It's not something I would use as a savings account, but you will get a little interest back. The thing to keep in mind on refund returns is that you only have 3 years to claim that refund. And this is something, I've got some other videos you can check out about claiming refunds and when those have to be filed by. Okay, so let's jump into some pro tips. There's not a whole lot we can do, especially after the fact, okay? So if you haven't filed, and I'm assuming if you're watching this video at this point, you have a few years of tax returns you haven't filed, there's not a lot you can do at this point. But if you're wondering, hey, what do I do and how do I reduce my interest and penalties before they happen, there's a couple things. The first thing you can do is to file an extension. Filing an extension will move the due date of the tax return back 6 months. So the calculation of the late filing penalty will then be 6 months less because it's out 6 months. This, of course, is secondary to the big preference of filing the return on time, even if you don't owe. And that's your second tip, is that a lot of times I get from people that, you know what, I knew I was going to owe taxes, so I didn't file my return. Well, you can reduce the penalties that you eventually will pay when you decide, when you get the money and will pay the taxes, by filing the return, even if you can't pay the taxes due. So the third tip is to jump into an installment agreement as soon as you can. That will reduce the interest and penalties because you'll begin paying on it instead of that tax amount just sitting stagnant and not making any headway. That's the third pro tip. And then the fourth one is that you can consider penalty abatement. There are certain circumstances, especially if this is your first time being late with the filing of the penalty, where you can get those penalties reduced. So that's number 4. So to review, file an extension. Number 2, file on time even if you can't pay. Number 3, get into an installment agreement as soon as you can. And number 4, consider a penalty abatement and requesting that if there are certain set of circumstances. Again, I got other videos for that. So there's kind of your overview of the penalties and the interest and how much they're going to be as a rule of thumb. It's not the end of the world, but the penalties and interest do add up, and it's something that you need to consider when you're getting this return put together and planning on how to pay the taxes. If you need any help with all these things, filing old tax returns and dealing with the interest and penalties, that's what I do. I specialize in filing old returns and getting you caught up. In fact, here is your personal invitation to claim a free tax review. Get the information you need. Thanks for watching. Now go file your returns. Who's doing your taxes?